But in the world today, there are those who would destroy our American heritage, who would tear down our ideals, trample underfoot the flag that came into being. So let's be alert and realize as Americans that freedom is everybody's job, Video Rangers. Now let's get back to our story.
The 1940s was an incredibly significant time for not just the film industry, but the entire world as we knew it. The American film landscape became a mirror of what the American public were only hearing about through newspapers and radio broadcasts. The war changed American film, or at least film within Hollywood, to represent the deep patriotism that Americans felt they needed at such a time of constant conflict. One of the two most prominent and famous American films from the 1940s, Casablanca, was a moralistic story set during the war. It told a black and white story about Americans trumping over who was perceived to be the public enemy at the time, Germans. It is so blatantly war propaganda, yet that doesn't stop the film from shining even when its intentions are so clear to anyone. Yet, it is those intentions that make it such a vital piece of Hollywood and American cinema. The 1930s to 40s saw the rise of the noir genre, and with it came an archetype so ingrained within American society that the very basis of America's deep patriotism hinges on this archetype becoming a stereotype. This archetype would not only cement the noir genre for what it is, but would also translate over and similarly cement a large part of what the Western genre would mean for America at its peak. In Casablanca, Humphrey Bogart portrays a less than reluctant American hero. The setting of Casablanca is important, as despite not being his home, Bogart is quick to defend the honor and status of those around him, even if it costs him his life. Bogart portrays the assumption that Americans have always wanted for themselves. The ideal American is one who is willing to defend those weaker. Casablanca would portray an inherent manipulation of the truth, in both its characters and moralistic stands. These attributes of the American hero will go on to become the ideal for most American men, as something to strive for. Many of the biggest actors in Hollywood at the time would shape their personality around these characteristics, with their own personal tweaks. In the previously mentioned Western genre, John Ford and John Wayne had already created a Western ideal by the end of the 40s, following the exact same path as Bogart. Wayne's first appearance in any of his collaborations with Ford in Stagecoach was presented in such a purely American way that he couldn't do anything but live under that public persona until he began to reevaluate his place in the American ideal with The Searchers and The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance.
Hold it! Whoa, steady, ho, ho!
There most certainly were performers who went against this ideal, such as Henry Fonda in his later years, but the pure mysticism and allure of the American hero clearly attracted many to make it as prolific a spectacle as it was. And at such a time of heavy opposition, the idealistic fashion of the hero caught on. On came the 60s, and it's clear the American hero couldn't withstand the test of time. As with the dawn of a new decade fastly approaching, America became a divided country. Now that the narrative of standing up to the Axis powers could not stand, America faced a period of self-reflection. The youth of America looked to gain the self-awareness to assess their country's blatant exploitation of smaller countries. Vietnam and America's occupation of Cuba sought to facilitate a rise in what we now know as counterculture. Counterculture can commonly be used to describe the idea that America's conservatist way of living is flawed, that full patriotism without question leads to complacency, and that the way things were going should not be the status quo. The Kennedy administration caused waves among conservatives of the 60s for their liberal attitudes towards integration and progression among the social structure of America. His assassination in 1963 sent ripples among the youth of America and served as a wake-up to just how deep the corruption and flaws in America's authoritative state went. Despite the freedom and liberty ideals present in the idea of America's foundation, there was a deep mistrust in the governmental system, with many even going as far as to believe that they killed their own president for policies the country wasn't ready for. The mistrust even reached as far as the film industry, as studios practically went bankrupt from a severe amount of distance between them and their audiences, who were now the youth spawned post-war. A steady oversaturation of musicals with overinflated budgets, historical epics that ran for boring amounts of time, and films that still held on to the elitist idealism of wartime America ruined the reputation the American film industry had for being the most premium form of entertainment. The lack of representation for alternative cultures was felt in what would become the birth of New Hollywood. We began to see a shift for the better as studios, in a historical change, had to rely on independent creatives, carry them all the way through until the 90s, and out of a crash could have ended the industry altogether. This independent movement is known better in the modern day for allowing pioneers like Quentin Tarantino, Paul Thomas Anderson, and Richard Linklater into the system. But before their time, we had people like Dennis Hopper, James Dean, and Mike Nichols. These were simply a few of the people who understood the experience of being on the outside of the status quo for 60s America. All of a sudden, the very basis of the American hero could not relate to the younger generations. They had no outside enemy to join against, while those meant to help bring their ideals to fruition were actively preventing them from simply living. Humphrey Bogart's characters of reserved yet subtly patriotic disposition could no longer suffice, and characters that accurately portrayed America's flaws were demanded from the public. The veil had been lifted and reality setting. If we look at Peter Bogdanovich's 1971 The Last Picture Show, we can truly come to terms with how aggressively apparent the changes in Americana culture was. The picture show depicts a desolate Texas town, similar in aesthetics to the kind of towns you'd find in the 1800s, with what we now know as the Wild West. A simple social gathering house, and a diner is practically all that stands on either side of the wide road, connecting each end of the town's exits. There is a singular picture house, still standing, which exclusively plays westerns from classic American heroes like John Wayne and Jimmy Stewart. Without stretching, it is clear that this town, having refused to adapt to the change in America, has reinstated its ran-down status again and again. Bogdanovich portrays the exact way that America's held values were crumbling before most of its people's eyes, as the conservatism held by Christianity was abandoned for the pleasures of sexual liberation. We see each young resident of the town grow resentful for the status of that environment, trying desperately to escape what is clearly a doomed and empty way of living. All of a sudden, Bogdanovich has created a portrayal of Americana culture so vital to the societal changes the country went through during the 60s and 70s that his film based in fiction gains a documentative status. He brings an intrinsic understanding to the idea of youth that the old studio systems just could not compete with, and as a result helped carry forward the new age of Hollywood into success that would carry forward for decades after.
The United States is a republic, and a republic is a state in which the people are the boss. That means us. And if the big shots in Washington don't do like we vote, we don't vote for them, by golly, no more.
Anymore.
Anymore.